Welcome, heroes and villains, back to Fjuke Enterprises YouTube channel. I'm your host, Fjuke, and today we are continuing a quest that has gone a bit dry, but I'm still working at. I'm trying to interview all the game masters that will allow me, and today we are here with Molly.
Oh,
So, how did you get into tabletop role-playing games?
so I actually ended up introduced by a former group of friends that had invited me to play with them, and they introduced me to Pathfinder First Edition. I played with them for not very long, unfortunately, because they were not very consistent about facilitating games, so I only ended up playing 3 or 4 games. But I liked it, and I learned the system for it, and then basically tried to find a group but was unsuccessful for a few years. And then when the pandemic hit, I was like, you know what? I'm just going to run one of my own. So Pathfinder was the only system I knew well enough to run, and that's the one I ended up going with.
Scheduling the BBEG of all D&D, all role-playing games.
Absolutely.
So, what systems have you played?
So I've played Pathfinder First Edition, I've played D&D 5e, and I've done a little bit of a test with the Silver Age Sentinels. I've learned bits and pieces of others, like Vampires of the Masquerade, and there's a few others that I've... it's a futuristic one, but I don't remember the name of it right now. I haven't played them, though. I've only played 5e and D&D and Pathfinder 1e.
Already explained this, but how did you go from being a player to being a GM?
It was basically a huge jump. There wasn't really opportunities to play as a player, so I decided to become a facilitator and make my own game to make sure I was as accurate as possible. And there was a lot of learning at the first sessions. If you listen to them, it's pretty rough as I'm trying to figure out all the different things to navigate. But it was steep learning curve, but I really enjoyed it, and I think my players had a good time.
Any role-playing systems you refuse to run?
It would depend. I only know 1E at this time well enough to run, but I wouldn't be opposed to running other systems provided they were suited to the task. So, for example, I do run one-shots. I'm considering learning 5E better because it's a bit quicker for character creation, which can be helpful for one-shots. Unfortunately, it's a lot more restricted as well. So it would depend on how easy it is to pick up the system, as well as how conducive it is to meet the needs of what the players are looking for.
I think you answered this question several times, but I'm going to ask it anyways. What systems do you enjoy running?
I really like running 1E. I find it very open-ended. It can be hard to do initial character creation because it's so broad at this point and there's been so much built into it, but it has a lot of options for homebrewing and adjustments and giving custom rewards, which I really like to do as a GM, where I will have the players do homework, and then that homework gets turned into buffs that I hand out. So I find it's a lot easier to hand out small skill buffs, etc. in Pathfinder. I'm not sure how you would do that in a balanced way in D&D. At least 5e D&D.
Do you have any common house rules?
So my common house rules tend to be homework, which basically is that when we, at least for the first bit of the campaign, the players will go home with homework, which is a question about their character's backstory or how their character feels about the other players in the campaign or the world in general, etc. And it gives the players a chance to just think more about how their character would act and think and participate in the world. And then I give them buffs in response. So skill checks, extra languages, sometimes I give them extra feats or traits. That would be my biggest one that I love to do. And typically I tend to fade that out as the campaign goes on and people get really comfortable with their characters. Another house rule I tend to do is luck rolls for traveling. So basically every day of travel, I tend to have the players do a luck roll, and 100% is perfect luck. In my sessions, 0 is horrible. And that gives me just kind of an idea, if they're going from one place to the next, how smooth their traveling will be. So if you roll really good, maybe you'll come across a abandoned treasure. If you roll really bad, you could get eaten by a purple worm and have to dig your friend out from underground. Both have happened. So it just adds a little bit of a variable to the adventure and has the players feel like they're more interacting with the world and immersive in the world, as opposed to me just dictating the events of what happens on their journeys.
Are there any moments of the players completely surprising you that you would like to share at this time?
I mean, there's always going to be moments. I play open world, so I don't have a set story that the players are playing through. So I end up allowing them to a lot more freedom to embrace the chaos of what their characters might choose to do. At one point, I knew one of my characters really loved cats, so I introduced a family of feral cats. And he decided, which surprised me, that he only wanted the babies. And he grabbed the mama cat and yeeted her out of the house and rolled a crit success on his check, and then stole the kittens and brought them back and handed them out to other children that had been shipwrecked with them. So that player ended up leaving. I was planning on having the cat stalk him throughout the entire campaign, but that didn't end up playing out. I also had another situation where I had a player end up accidentally forgetting something. Basically, they had a cursed item and they had not touched it. And then the next time they took out the item, they forgot to specify that they had not touched it, ended up evoking the curse on themselves and unable to speak. And as a caster, they ended up basically unable to cast and having to communicate through miming and writing notes and holding them up. So that was a very surprising and really interesting character development situation that occurred.
Any moments of everything going to plan that is a fond memory for you?
Know if going to plan really works per se in my campaigns, because it's not like I have a specific plan when I set things up. I tend to set up scenarios and they can choose to interact with it in a positive way or a negative way or in an unexpected way. And so it just ends up being, I enjoy with very fondness, the chaos of them trying to figure out how to negotiate situations because they know I have things up my sleeve. I know a particularly fond memory was I ended up with a courtesan guild situation, which ended up being an entire side quest that I had not expected, where the players spent, I don't know, probably like 100 hours in this town because they didn't like the way the courtesan guild ran, and they took it completely out and reset up an entire different system of leadership, etc. And they all got really, really engaged and really invested in the characters that they were working with, to both the courtesans and the other people in the guilds that were kind of of the same mind as they were. And it ended up being really interesting character-wise as well as story-wise to just see them all interact and become invested in the NPCs I'd created.
As my penultimate question, do you have any advice for your fellow game masters out there?
I think it would be to have a plan, but not be stuck with the plan. So when I've been a player, there's been times where I've had a GM that had a decision that they wanted to happen. They had a scenario that they'd set up. And they specifically, in this case, were trying to force combat. And the players ended up having lots of really creative and role-playing situations and explanations as to why they could evade that combat. And the GM just couldn't adapt to that. So they ended up forcing the combat in really bizarre and uncomfortable and railroady ways that just didn't feel natural or pleasant for the players. Versus if he had have just allowed us to RP out of it and gone, you know what? All right, I guess we're not doing that combat. Another one would be to make sure you're not getting too bogged down in the legalism of doing it correctly, as opposed to just enjoying the process. So when I was a new GM, I didn't have all the precise answers. I still don't have all the precise answers. But if I didn't know, we would try to look it up quickly. If we couldn't find it, I just picked something, we went with it. And if it ended up unbalanced, we made adjustments later. So if it was like a DC for a poison, I don't need to know the exact poison. If I know approximately what my characters can roll, try to give them something that they can potentially beat, but might also fail, and just go with that, as opposed to getting really specific poison, specific DC, specific effects. Choose things that work and adapt as you go.
As my final question, is there anything or anyone that you would like to shout out at this time?
I mean, I'd love to shout out my website. I've developed an entire homebrew world. It's called Styria, and I have a website that I've built for it for my players to have something to access, but I'm also constantly growing it and developing it and trying to make it something that other GMs could use as well if they wanted to for content. So if people want to chat with me and help contribute, or just find things helpful and want to read it, that would be awesome. I mean, traffic and for the website would be great, and getting more input on different concepts always makes them grow and develop in interesting and beautiful ways.
Until we clash again, may all your heroics and schemes be successful. And don't forget to like and comment. And thank you, Molly, for joining us today.
Thank you for the interview.